Welcome, everybody, to the Brothers Show. It's so good to see Gordon Ferguson, our guest here with us tonight. This week, we're going to be talking about Rise Up, O Men of God. And we chose that theme because last week, all week long, the women were building up to Easter Sunday and talking about the resurrection. And now this week, since Jesus has been risen, we're going to be talking about, okay, after the resurrection, what do we need to be doing? Have we been raised? There's a scripture in Romans chapter 6 that talks about being baptized into Christ, and then we're raised up into a new life. And what we're hoping to talk about, we've got a number of people here tonight to ask some questions and pipe in every once in a while, and I'll be introducing them as we go along. But what we're really wanting to talk about is, in this new life, can we be better men? And a couple of our guests tonight, of course, are women, and I don't think you can really talk about being better men without getting a woman's perspective on that. And certainly because most of us here tonight are people of faith, I've got to believe that the things in Jesus Christ that we believe will make common sense to most anyone. And so this week, all week long, we've asked some people to come in and talk about different angles, different ideas, their perspective on what it means to be a better man. And so tonight we've got Gordon Ferguson here all the way from Texas. We've got some local faces that we're all going to be able to recognize. And we just want to hang out a little bit and talk about being better people. I know in the last couple of weeks, all of us have probably learned some phrases that we didn't know before. At least most of them are new to me, and I think they're probably new to you. We talk about social distancing, where, of course, the whole coronavirus, that's a new one on me. Flattening the curve, before this time, flattening the curve meant for me to suck at my belly when I was having a picture taken or something. So lots of new phrases, lots of new things that are going on that we're talking about and thinking about. A lot of people feeling isolated. We want to just pull people together, and what's better right now to be able to pull Gordon all the way from Texas to talk to us. Gordon, how you doing? It's good to have a connection with us. Let's look at Gordon and hi, Tyler. Good to see you too. But let's talk to Gordon.
Yeah, I'm across the street from a lake in East Texas with a very, very slow internet. So we'll see how this goes. If I cut off, I'm not mad at anyone, just got cut off.
You're good so far.
Yeah, good. So I'm here.
I see you. And thanks again. Gordon and I have been friends for a long, long, long time. And I think as the years go by, we only get closer. I told Gordon a few weeks ago, it's nice to have someone who's just a little bit older to be able to lean on his shoulder. And Gordon and I talked, for over an hour last week, and we recorded that. And we're going to have that put on our website, on the YouTube channel, and post that later. Right, Jenna?
Yep.
That'll go up right after this show together. But Gordon, we've talked enough. I've told you some things that we'd be sharing, and you told me some things that you wanted to share. But when I talk about being a better man, what comes to mind? What do you want to get into and us chatter about tonight?
Well, after you mentioned that, I thought about being a better man. I thought immediately about Jesus, and whatever he was is what we want to be, and he came to the earth as a male, as a man. And I thought about a book that I read, 40 years ago, a long time ago. And if I recall the title, it was Jesus, a Man of Steel and Velvet. And so I enjoyed the book when I did read it many, many years ago, but I started thinking about, okay, he's a man of velvet, which means he's very sensitive, very sensitized. When you look at his life in the Gospels, children were drawn to him. He was very sensitive. He was kind of person that people approached, they were not afraid of. He definitely attracted women in a very good way. They were spiritually looking for help, and Jesus offered that, and they became his followers and helped support him financially and a number of other things. They were the ones that saw him on the resurrection morning first. So I thought about that side of Jesus, that not only were children attracted to him, but also, I think, young people. I think basically the early church was started off kind of as a youth movement. Most religious movements that are radical and start changing the world are youth movements. The Apostle John had to be a teenager if a revelation came out when everyone says that he did. So I have the idea that probably the apostles were generally young. Jesus worked well with young people. The older ones he had a little more difficulty with, at least a lot of them, the religious leaders. But he certainly then was very much in tune with women, and they followed him around, wanted to hear every word he had to say. And so both of those areas show me his sensitivity. Then the Jesus of steel would just be his unyielding resolve to hold on to truth, teach truth, to live by truth, to challenge with truth. So those were some of the things that I thought about today after we talked about it this morning. And I can elaborate on all those in a lot of detail.
Well, don't hold back. Go ahead. Start elaborating.
Well, yeah, on the youth side, I've been thinking a lot about that. I've recently written a book called The Power of Spiritual Relationships. The last chapter is My Hope is in Our Youth. And so I went back through history. I talked about what I thought about the early church and how many young people really carried the torch in that. Then I've looked at the Reformation movement and guys like Luther. He was maybe on the shy side of 30 when he really got into a lot of his thinking that led to some pretty radical moves. Calvin was in his 20s when he began to do all the amazingly prolific writing that he did. Then you come on up to the American Restoration movement, and the two main guys in the early stages of that, Campbell was in his 20s when he began to have quite a mark on those that followed him. Stone was probably around 30. And then you move on up into our campus ministry days. It spawned what we now call the ICOC. And you got Chuck Luthus at about 30 and Kip McKean at about 25. And so to me, what I've seen historically is that when people have a dream to change the world, it often starts with young people. And so I've got concerns about our movement having lost a generation back some time ago. And I don't think we've nearly made it up, and we still don't have enough younger people having a voice of influence. We're hiring younger people, more of them, but basically we see them as campus ministry people or youth and family people, and it takes them a really long time to have a voice that shapes things as far as something more significant. So I've got a lot of feelings about that. Young people hear it well, older people sometimes not so well. Maybe I don't say it so well. I'll own that part of it occasionally. And then on the women's side of it, I'm very interested in the women's place, gender inclusion, and what women do in the church, especially in the church. And so I've got feelings there that we have not used women nearly as much as I think we should have. I've been beating on a drum for years and years and years about having women in leadership groups. I've just always thought it was rather, how can I say this in a kind way? Stupid is the word that comes to mind, but I always thought it was kind of stupid to have meetings of men only determining directions for the church when over half the church is made up of women. And so I've said for a long time, women need to be involved a lot more than they are involved. And of course, that's a hot topic now. I've written a bit on that, spoken some on it, but I think women could play much bigger roles in the church than they are playing. And as far as leadership goes, I've always felt like women should be involved in leadership on a pretty equal basis with men in deciding directions, because over half the church is made up of women. So a lot of feelings on that one as well. You can ask me questions on those in a moment, but on the steel side of Jesus, integrity is a word that comes to mind. Integrity means that we're going to do what's right, whether anyone knows it or not, whether anyone is watching it or not. And so one of the challenges that I've had as a leader for a long time is to try to help all of us as leaders think in terms of some R's and not think in terms of other R words. To think about what's righteous and what is right, and not to think very long about possible responses and reactions. And too many times we make judgments or fail to make judgments because we're concerned about a certain negative response or negative reaction or whatever. And that could be true on the other things I talked about. The role of younger people, the role of women. We could be too concerned about reactions or responses. And my question always is pretty simple. What's right and what's righteous? And then whatever reactions and repercussions and other R words come, we'll deal with them when they come, but right is always right. And that's the only thing that I want to make decisions based on, is what is right and what is righteous before God. So that's just a quick overview of a couple of areas that I thought about today when I thought about Jesus as the man of steel and the man of velvet. Jesus was a confrontational person when it came to truth. He wasn't worried about reactions. And so that part of Jesus, I think we've got to be real men. We've got to be courageous. We've got to be truth seekers, truth doers, insisters on truth. And then on the other side of sensitivity, it seems to me that we've got to be sensitive in a lot of different areas. The mark of a leader is someone that can work with as many different types of people as possible. Jesus certainly did that with that motley crew we call apostles. And to me, a leader, a real man who's leading in any capacity, he's got to be able to work with all kinds of people. If you're a father or a grandfather, you're dealing with some very different children or grandchildren. And you can't play favorites. They may be as opposite you as they could be, but you've still got to figure out what they are tuned to, what their love languages are, what makes them function, what their gifts are, meet them where they are, and rejoice in the way that God made them. So, do you want me to keep talking, or do you want to talk some?
Well, you jumped right in. That's a lot to unpack. You said a whole lot. You went straight to being like Jesus.
Right.
And you did a couple of really great topics, talking about youth and talking about women and really talking about gender issues, talking about women and talking about men. And, I asked you, well, what makes a man better? And you went to these subjects right off. Why don't we go ahead and open this up? We've got Tyler Pickle, one of the brothers here. He is a professional counselor, and Carl, of course, is one of our well-known brothers in the church and a musician and a dear friend. Jenna, of course, is the one that has been helping us with all this tech stuff we're doing. And before we come back to this topic, I want to introduce Juliana Oliphant. Juliana, thanks for being here with us tonight. Juliana's about to graduate. Congratulations. You're one of the people that the coronavirus, this COVID-19 has tried to derail your plans, but how's it going so far? Tell us what you're dealing with right now. then we'll come back to some stuff. Go ahead.
Sounds good. Yeah, so I just completed my senior practicum, or my capstone, which was basically summative nursing program. And I had my final clinical rotation where I was working as a nurse and with Providence. And my hours were within March and April, kind of when the whole coronavirus kind of started and hit the States, and everybody kind of panicked and was trying to figure out what do we do. And so as a student and in the hospital, it's kind of a weird transition for sure. But I think every day within the hospital is very different. As new evidence comes out, as the trends continue with the CDC and just trying to figure out how the virus is spreading, every day there's new policies on how we're going to conserve PPE, how we're going to protect healthcare workers, how we're going to protect our patients, how we're going to limit the spread within the hospital. And so like right now they're doing safety checks before anyone can come into the hospital. So doing like temperature and giving masks to healthcare providers. And now going into rooms, we have to wear masks and like face shields at all times to prevent us as healthcare providers spreading the virus to our patients who are very much in vulnerable populations and tend to be elderly. So it's definitely a hard place to work. A lot of the nurses that I've talked to, they try to separate themselves from their families when they go home. A lot of them like stay in separate rooms and don't really interact with their families very much. Social distancing, so they can prevent their families from really contracting the disease as well, working in a very high traffic area where the virus is. I didn't personally care for any of the coronavirus patients, but there's always that fear of what if a patient has it and they don't know, and that we don't know. And a lot of times, like, the virus doesn't really affect you until a couple of weeks, so it can be hard to know. And a lot of symptoms tend to be related to other things, but you never know what is actually the virus. So it's definitely been a challenging time, especially graduating this year. My graduation has been moved to online, so that's different. I'm from Hawaii, so I won't be able to go home for a while. So there's a lot of change in my life, but I'm really grateful for being a part of the healthcare field and seeing the work that so many people do, and dedication and the resilience that a lot of healthcare workers have and are working towards, because it's really challenging and everyone's freaking out and everyone's trying to stay calm, and it can be a very overwhelming and anxiety-ridden time, but I'm grateful that we have God, and so hopefully it all works out.
Well, and we're very, very thankful. This gives us all here an opportunity, and anyone that's joining us tonight. We've got someone young, you're about to graduate, but you have been on the front line they're talking about. You've been in there, and we applaud you. We're so thankful for what you're doing, and tonight we'll let you represent the thousands upon thousands of doctors and nurses who are risking their lives at this very, very intense time. So we love you. Thank you. We're proud of you. And you fit a couple of categories that Gordon just brought up. You're a woman. You're young. Let's just open this up and talk and try to unpack some of the things that Gordon shared. Any thoughts from anybody else here about what Gordon has launched into yet? And I think all of you are unmuted, and if you talk, I think you get center stage. And if you need a little bit more time to gather your thoughts, I never have trouble talking.
I appreciate Gordon, what you shared. This is Tyler Pickle, and it's good to see some of you guys and have so many people at home joining tonight. I thought it was really interesting, and it wasn't exactly what I expected you to share and to get into, but honestly, it must be the spirit, because when I talked to Steve, he told me the title was very similar. Some of the thoughts that I had, one of the first thoughts I had was like obviously Jesus, but then also like, women, like what is women's role in men being better men, and how do we as men find find the velvet part of Jesus, like you shared, which is often more associated within our society and within our culture with women. And how do we, as men, find that in ourselves? But I was curious, Gordon, from your experiences and from your knowledge, what you might recommend, or what anybody here, I guess, or what people's thoughts are on what is a man's role in supporting and empowering women to be more involved in leadership.
Well, I think a lot of study is going on right now. I've certainly done a bit of that myself, read a number of books, read a lot of articles, etc. But when I open up the book of Acts, chapter 2, and Peter quotes from Joel to tell me what the new church is going to look like, he talks about young people, he talks about women, he talks about people dreaming dreams and doing great things and all of that. He mentions twice that women are going to prophesy. So I would be immediately awakened to the idea that, wow, women are going to play a lot different role now in the new covenant than they did in the old. And of course, there were women that played some vital roles in the old covenant, but this was going to be a regular thing. And like the Holy Spirit indwelling everyone that got baptized into Christ in the Old Testament, you did not find a lot of mention of the Holy Spirit being in people. But the new covenant was going to be a very different thing, so that all of us that are baptized into Christ have the Spirit to indwell us and lead us and bless us and work through us and all of those things. So we expect more from Acts 2 as far as Holy Spirit involvement in our lives, which is a marvelous subject in its own. But you would also look to young people, and you would also look to women to have more of a role in the new covenant by a good margin, it would seem to me, than you did in the old covenant. And of course, I know that in the New Testament days, it was a very patriarchal setting. But I think we've got to ask ourselves, well, okay, it was patriarchal, so you did have still a dominance among men as leaders in certain roles. You did have that. But you also had things like slavery that were built into that society. It was just a part of the society. As important as it sounds to us, it was, a large percentage of people were slaves in the Roman society. But I don't think God ever intended that to remain that way. And so when he talked about in Galatians 3, neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male or female, I think he was saying that the sort of setting that we've had, that's going, as Jesus has more and more influence in the world, that is going to diminish, and there are going to be changes, and you're going to see people on equal footing, regardless of race, regardless of gender. And so I've got a very big interest in the whole race thing as well. I have a blog called Black Tax and White Benefits, because I feel like you've got people, because of the color of their skin, whose value is diminished in the eyes of a lot of people, certainly not God's, certainly not in the church. I mean, that's the very mystery of Christ that Paul talked about in Ephesians. He's saying the mystery of Christ that has not been known, that is known now, is the fact that God can take people, races that hated each other, Jew and Gentile, in this case, and put them all together in a way that affects the whole world. And so when I think about that whole topic, there needs to be an equality of race, an equality of gender. I do not see males as superior to females. I don't buy into some things. I'm not through studying it all, but I don't go to Genesis 1, for example, and say, well, God made males first, so he evidently must have wanted males to be the ones that were the natural leaders, and women would have a subservient role to him because he was created first. when I look at the creative order of Genesis, it seems to me it went from disorder to order. And so a part of that is God begins to separate the sky and those sorts of things. When he gets down to living things, you start off with the plants and trees and all of that. And then you move on to birds and the fish, and then you move on to domesticated animals and wild animals, and finally you get humans created. Seems to me that he's kind of moving up the scale as the creation goes, wouldn't you think? And so I always said that I could understand the Israelites after they left Egypt. They didn't have any leeks and garlics and onions, and I always thought God must have made those last in the vegetable kingdom, because food would never taste so good without those. And so that's, I can't prove that he made those last, but that's sort of the way I think about creation, is it was getting better and better. And so when he capped it off with a female, to me it almost says, wow, that's kind of the apex of his creation right there.
So you're saying that women are like the onions of
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying unless you just see them as the flavor of life, it makes everything else better. Yeah, I'll buy into that one, but I'm not going to let you pull me into that corner.
No, I'm sure we've all noticed that the only thing in creation that God said wasn't good was what? Was for man to be alone.
Man to be alone.
And that's usually true. And though this is the men's week and this is the brothers show, one of the things that I think we can take note of is it's probably pretty good for us to have the other perspective on things. One of the things I wanted to ask you, Gordon, I know that hopefully what we'll accomplish, over time, gathering like this, is a time that there'll be sons and brothers and fathers, husbands, a lot of men, hopefully coming, and they hear Gordon is going to be here, and Steve is wanting to do something. Rise up, O men of God, and men are looking for some spiritual challenge and direction. And a couple of things that I think would help all of us. These subjects, for some people, are really thorny. For some of us, we have kind of moved on in our hearts with the idea that women should be doing the things that men are doing in the church, that it should be gift-based and not gender-based. But I'm super aware of the fact that a lot of people I love and respect and go to church with don't agree with that. And so a couple of things. One is, how do you think we can keep loving each other and care about each other, be as united as possible, and see these things differently? That's part one of my question, and I'll be quiet for a second. You know what I'm talking about? Because I have changed my mind on these subjects. And to change my mind, I want to keep it in here that me changing my mind is me thinking I was wrong, and now I think differently. But I want to find a way. Is it possible? I want to find a way to do that without it sounding like I am offensively telling other people who still think what I used to thought, that it's wrong. I mean, you must have had to deal with this a bit already, have you?
Well, I think all of us, as we learn, we change, and we have to find out, I think I was mistaken, and so I've learned a better way. I think the way that we say it's very important, but I think in every area of life, it's a constant learning process. We all have views that are mistaken. I had some views about the virus that were mistaken. I did some things that put myself at some risk that I wouldn't do now, but I had to learn more. That's life, is you learn more. There are certain topics that, for whatever reason, are a little more emotionally charged. I'm not sure I quite understand that. For example, on the gender thing. There are other subjects that we can talk about and differ on, and for some reason, this one is so emotionally laden. And I'm not sure I understand that. I think sometimes I wonder if we males are just threatened by women, and I don't know why. I mean, our mothers, our grandmothers, teachers, some of the most important people in our lives from the time we were born have been females. Timothy would not have been what Timothy was if it weren't for a mother and a grandmother. And all of us have those experiences. Some years ago, if I remember the story right, Hallmark card company, greeting card company, in some prison gave free cards for Mother's Day if the men wanted to take them and write the cards. And virtually everyone did. They wanted to write a Mother's Day card if their mothers were alive. Then Father's Day came around, and they made the same offer, and very, very few took advantage of that. Now, don't quote me too loudly without doing some research on that, but it made sense to me. Mothers are incredibly influential in our lives. Grandmothers are. That's my case with my mother, who influenced me to believe the Bible was God's Word, helped me to love the Bible, love the truth. She helped me to love children, and she helped me to love characters. I think I mentioned that the last time we talked. That's why I like you, Steve. You qualify. But
so did you say I am a character, or I have?
You are a character,
or I have character.
Well, both. I'll give you both of those. But my mother was tremendously influential in my life. My grandmothers. I hardly knew my grandfathers. They died young. And you think back to teachers, you think back to a lot of people. So women have a lot of influence. Why is it then, when we talk about gender inclusion or women's roles, why is there an emotionally charged part of that? I'm not sure. I remember, because of my convictions for decades, that women should be involved in leadership groups and help discuss things and directions for churches and how to handle problems and all of that. I believe that for decades and pled for it, and on occasion was successful, on other occasions not so successful. I never did understand why business meetings needed to be male things without the presence of females. I got tired of going home and telling my wife, here's what we decided, and heard her say, you decided what? Have you thought about this and this and this? And then I've got to call another meeting to go back and straighten out what we males decided without having a woman's perspective. So as a pragmatist, I didn't like doing that and tried to change that years ago. My personal getting into the women's role back in some years ago, I don't know, 20 years ago, we did re-examine that topic, and I was an elder in Boston and a teacher in Boston at the time. I presented a paper, put it in a book that talked about things like women, being a part of ushering and serving communion and making announcements and, other things, sharing at a communion, that type of thing. I took that banner up 20 some years ago. And then the more recent delving into it came up because others were doing it, but especially women. Wyndham and Jeannie Shaw have been among my closest friends for a really long time. And Jeannie was studying out the topic and asked me to read some things that she had written and give me her honest opinion. I did that by email, and it was a very strong opinion, and it was very opinionated, and I honestly thought it could hurt our relationship. As close as we are, I thought it could have hurt our relationship. So not long after that, we were together. I'd gone to visit them and see Wyndham when he was still alive. Tried to get to Boston to see him at least twice a year. And so Jeannie and I sat down and talked, and even though I'd written a very strong letter disagreeing with some of the things that she had said. She was very calm, very spiritual, and just said, well, have you thought about this? And have you thought about that? And after a while, I got over my emotional state that I was in and started actually listening to what she said. And lo and behold, I thought, wow, that makes sense. Biblically, that makes sense. And I know it makes sense practically because of the way my marriage works. My wife is anything but a yes girl. She's got a lot of opinions. She expresses those opinions. We work together as a team. I don't make all the decisions. And the whole idea that I've read with a lot of people that hold on to what I think is a very traditional, older view, they feel like the male, the husband in a family, has to make the decisions. He has to make the final call on the decisions. And if that's true, that's a one-man leadership setting. And if it's the one-man leadership in the physical family, then I guess other people that believe there needs to be a one-man show, decision-making wise, in a spiritual family, in a church, then I guess, they could use the physical family model as something to imitate and have a one-man decision maker in a church, which I vehemently disagree with. Wyndham and I wrote a book called Golden Rule Leadership 20 years ago, and it was all about having a team leadership, that a team is better than one person when it comes to making decisions.
Yeah,
that's also true in a home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like what you're saying. Like, there's a really big question, kind of like to recap some of the stuff you were saying. There's a big question as to why some people might be threatened, and obviously I'm not a man. I can't speak from it from personal experience. But there is something I've noticed in like the history of what we've talked about so far. And I think in every situation where you're asking the other gender, like, or in just in any situation you're asking other people how to be better, there's a lot of humility that is involved. There's a lot of really seeking input and advice, and like if you're wanting to get better as a group, if you're wanting to get better as a community, like being outward. And like, I like how you mentioned where it's like it's difficult to grow outward if you're limiting the people that you get advice from, and I think for me there is one situation that I can relate to. So I am a woman in tech, and at my jobs I'm frequently the only woman who is working on my team. And so when another woman shows up and joins the team, despite, you thinking like, oh yeah, like, great, this is encouraging, like we're all here together to accomplish the same goal, it's kind of threatening a little bit, because my insecurity in my skills and my insecurity in what I do and who I am is kind of like shaken a little bit. Like, am I good enough? Like, are they going to outdo me? Like, is it going to, like, how is this going to affect the way people respect me? Are they going to look at me different? Are they going to compare us? Because I know they're going to compare us, and it's really difficult to kind of get over a lot of those mind games, especially when, people are watching. Like, I remember vividly somebody else showed up and everybody just looked at me because her and I were just so different. But I think, like, when you're asking the question, like, how do we get better, and I'm making it more generic, like, not necessarily how to be better as men, but how to be better humans, is listening to each other and being friends and realizing we're all accomplishing the same goal. Like, we're all trying to get to the same place and trying to maintain that security. Like, we have our security in God's plan, not necessarily how we see God's plan executed, but just that God's will is going to be done, So, I mean, those are just my thoughts on it, but I really appreciated your insight and the way the conversation was leading.
Well, your case with another woman coming in and you wondering how others might view the two of you or compare the two of you, that's not just a female thing. If you're the only one of a certain age category, the only one of a certain educational category, someone else joins, it would be looked at similarly. A person of maybe a minority in that group, minority race perhaps in that group, and another person comes in, you'll be compared simply because there are only two of you. But that's not so much a female thing, I think.
Yeah.
But to me, it needs to be a gift-based, experience-based, training-based situation, regardless of gender, race, age, anything else. That's what we're all striving for.
Let me interrupt you there, Gordon, because I'm sure because this is primarily, maybe solely, I don't know who all is joining us. I know there's a lot of questions that we're getting from the folks who are here with us, both here in this Zoom room and the people who are watching it live streamed right now. And there's some prominent scriptures that if you just read them straightforward in English, they can be confusing. And we could spend all night talking about things that Paul said about women being quiet. We can talk about the things that Paul talked about men being the head. There's a lot of specifics, and we're going to run out of time in a minute. I think maybe one umbrella question I'd like to ask you. It seems to be implied or inferred in what you're sharing. We grew up very similar in how we read the Bible. Our roots, you and me, are very, very similar. I grew up in a Bible Belt, what we would call a main line. We didn't have the term main line. It was the Church of Christ. It wasn't the main. It wasn't the main. It was it. And maybe you can talk a little bit in sticking with the theme and realizing we've got a lot of people with a lot of different viewpoints. Is there something you can say that could open all of our minds to maybe reading the Bible different from how you impressed me, and we've talked about it before. You don't read the Bible exactly the same way you did now as you did when you were young.
Right.
All of us believe God doesn't change. And a lot of people feel like culture's influencing us and some negative things are influencing us. But you are a scholar. You're a writer. You're a thinker. Is there something without being judgy or without being, and not that you are a condemning sort of person, but for folks that are disagreeing, I know I'm not absolutely sure about many things. I know what I believe right now and have convictions about now, and I don't think that my life is marked as someone who's been wishy-washy on a lot of things. But my mind has changed. A lot of it is I read the Bible. I read it as much, if not more than ever, but I see something different in it. I read it differently. And is there anything you would want to use to just tantalize or throw out there that might help all of us read it differently in a way that could pull us together and bring us together instead of drive us apart?
Well, you use the word culture, and a lot of people feel like we're restudying things like the women's robe because of present culture. And it is true that our present culture makes us look at things afresh from a lot of vantage points. We could say the same thing about the race issue, for example. There are things that drive us back to the Bible to restudy it out. So it's not just a gender issue that makes us want to go back and study. Present culture does have an influence to make us want to go back and make sure that we're looking at things the correct way. And so, but the word culture, from a biblical standpoint, I think that's one of the things that we need is to look at the Bible and the culture of the day and try to determine Is this an eternal principle that we are to follow, or was that a culturally based situation back then? And all of us, as I've already said, would say on the race issue, we could turn to passages. In fact, slave owners in this country did it, and enforced a lot of harshness by doing it, but they went back and looked at things in the New Testament about the way slaves were supposed to act toward slave owners, even harsh ones, etc. But we recognize there's a cultural basis for all of that. We're not going to continue to use that. We believe the principles of Christ point in a different direction than what we read about in the culture of that day regarding slaves and slave owners. So, what about the gender thing? Would there not be things that would be said because of a cultural setting in the New Testament that we would want to re-examine? I don't know where I land my own plane on some of this, to be honest. What I am concerned about is an unwillingness to restudy things, because the church that you and I were raised in, we were very much into what I call pattern theology. And so we were always looking for patterns. What they did, we need to do. And since we were looking for patterns, I grew up in a church that looked at Jesus when he instituted the communion, the Lord's Supper as we call it. It says that Jesus took the cup. And so I was raised in a church that took the cup, one cup, and passed it around. I would like to visit one of those churches today and see what they're doing with the virus. But at any rate, that was.
I don't think we're ever going to take communion the exact same way we've been doing it for years. Even
no.
I believe passing a bread that's been broken. One of my friends said, "Well, I'm just touching the outside of the cup," and the wife said, "Yeah, and the tray and everything that's been handled by yeah." But I hear what you're saying, and I think you and I are similar in thought on a lot of these things. But I have a confession to make, if I can stick it in here. It's the word objectification has become, one of these words that's used. There's a lot of words that we use now as if we always. I'd never heard the word objectification used in regards to gender when I was growing up. I was raised to believe that men were a certain way and women were another way, and men were supposed to act a certain way towards women. And my confession is, I started preaching when I was really young. I've read the Bible my whole life, but I brought my objectification of women to my Bible study. I already had an opinion about how God wanted men to be with women, and certainly I had a filter on it that there's a way Christian men are supposed to be, but it was still objectification. Did I say that? Yeah, I'm hearing my words in this. Anyway, I had women, and there would be blatant ways, and there would be subtle ways that it would show up in my words publicly. I'm not talking about publicly and privately, sure. I mean, with friends in my home, and I'm talking about as a married man and a father and a preacher, and completely in my mind oblivious to the idea that singling out, well, here's Brother Carl and his pretty wife, and let's get the pretty wife up there to talk. Now, there's still something ingrained in me, whether it's being Southern or whatever, that you want to pay a compliment or say something, but there's an underlying objectification there that it may not even be defensible for me for what I've done, but for certain, as it trickles down, there's an objectification that is abusive. There's an objectification that is threatening and is painful and is bad, and I think is sinful, that is in the hearts and consciences of men, that they can point and say, but that's even how Christian men talk. That's even how Christian men act. That's how. And so my confession is simply this: part of me changing the way I read the Bible isn't as much. There are you talked about people being open to studying. I think there are brilliant people who disagree with me, who have studied it for years and have never studied it more than they're studying it right now. But we're all still looking through some filters, some thoughts that we've had for a few hundred years. Some would argue a couple of thousand years, and there's the argument. I don't believe it's the way God intended it, but that's how I'm thinking, and I've changed my mind. So who's to say I won't change my mind again? But what I'm clear on now is so much of the Bible I've read, and the scriptures about women, the scriptures about men, the scriptures, the whole this I've read with this idea that men are stronger, men are more suited to do certain things. And I know I've been going for a while. I'm gonna come in for a landing. My whole life, I was told I was great. Great. My father, from the time I was I was a great walker. I was a great talker when I was an infant. My mom told me I was great. My parents told me there was nothing in the world I couldn't do if I wanted to. And we lived in the middle of a soybean field in Arkansas. And I went to school, and my teachers told me I was great. I went to schools where they loved whether it was art or writing or whatever I did. You're great. You can be great at this or that. And then I went to church, and they told me I was great. And all of it, though, as I grew, I was a great boy. I was a great young man. I was a great man. I was told you can do this. You can lead, and you can do this. You can do all of this stuff. And I got to be okay in math, even though I was lousy at math, and okay in science, because I was a boy, and there were things I was great at. I wonder, and you see so many women rising above the fact that they weren't told they were great their whole life. They were told the things they can't do. And of course, there's the joke for a woman to rise above. She's got to be able to do it backwards and in high heels. And that's really true. Because the first time in my life I was told I wasn't great, the first time I was told you suck, was as a preacher in the drama of the church. And my confidence unraveled. It just unraveled like it had never been there. So that to this day, when people talk about the old days and things that I used to do, it's like it was somebody else. And so it just makes me wonder for all of us, for my smarter friends who disagree and are studying this out, for my dumber friends who are like me, I wonder how much we've been brainwashed in thinking men are supposed to be a certain way and women are supposed to be a certain way. But the truth is, it's all just something that was made up by the devil in the fall. And that the fact is, there's God and there's Jesus, and the rest of us are all the same. I don't know where'd that come from. I don't know. But I think I have almost used up all of our time. Gordon, thanks a lot. Let's get a final statement from Gordon, and then some final comments from anyone here that wants to say something. Gordon?
Yeah, I will say that I do have an article or two on my website, gordonferguson.org. And I think I left an old one on there about women's role that I did 20 years ago, just to show historically where we were and where I was at the time as we were trying to make some changes that in that day seemed significant. There's a newer article in which I deal with some of the passages that you mentioned that cause some problems along this line. It's not a real in-depth thing, but it was a long sermon before it got on paper, I'll put it that way. So that would be worth reading. But I think there are a lot of stereotypical things that we think about all kinds of areas, and females fall into that. We have stereotypical views of women that I think are wrong, and I think they have been hurt by that. Just like we have stereotypical, make the comparison there with race, stereotypical views that are just flat wrong. They're prejudicial, but they are unconscious on our part. So I call them systemic. They're built in. We don't recognize them until someone helps us see them, and then it pops out everywhere. You see so much in your own self in some of these areas. Once you get enlightened a bit about them, you start seeing, wow, if I was a woman and I heard a guy put it that way, that would hurt my feelings. So I think all of us need to get more enlightened, just in general, about how we make people feel with our stereotypical, systemic views of other people, be it gender, race, or a lot of other areas that we could talk about.
Well, I want to say you have never stopped, as the old preacher said, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Thanks for the things that you shared with us. Does anybody want to make a parting shot before we close out tonight? I've got just a few last statements, and I'm going to ask Carl in a minute to play us out. Go ahead, Tyler.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think just to connect some dots, Steve, I really appreciated what you shared about your journey as a young man, and I think that feels really congruent to I think my experience as a young man as well, where doors have always been open to me. Things haven't always been easy, but I've never gotten real hard no's, or culturally, there hasn't been a lot in my way as a young man, so trying to still be a young man in progressing in my career, or in really whatever I wanted to do outside of that. And I think that has a lot to do with what we tell people their value is from a young age. And for a lot, I think, right, this is my perspective as a man, but I think sometimes we as a society tell women that their value is in being pretty, or is in their looks, or is in particular things that very much limits who they can foresee themselves being, and who society allows them to be or supports them in being. Which is why I think, what Jenny was sharing earlier, which I really appreciated, Jenny, you sharing that story as well. Like when a woman or a person of color or any other minority within our society, people who have not been the decision makers in our society for hundreds or thousands of years, get to a place within a field where they are the one of 5 or 10 who represents that, I think those feelings of competition become a lot stronger, because it's like, man, I've had to work so hard just to get to this place, and there may not be room for 2 of us in these seats of 12, because society has told us, society has limited leadership, oftentimes to just white men, truthfully. And so one thing that, 2 more things just that I want to say real quick. Like, I think the world has really been created for white men, and has been run by white men for so long that I think it makes it really hard for people who are not of that identity to make it to that place. And like, Steve, your story, like the first time you were told, I can't remember exactly what, how you put it, but you were not good at being a preacher or something, happened in your young adulthood, or middle adulthood, I don't know. Some point in your journey.
I'm still in my young adulthood.
Yeah, okay, great. So in your infancy then, I think that is a message that has been told to oppressed populations throughout their lives, which is part of what stifles their development in some of those ways. And so I think one way that, men, in getting back to the topic, being a better man, one way or a couple ways that men can really fight against that is by amplifying the voices of people who are oppressed or less respected in communities, right? So like when people of color or people or women speak up in a group, we can emphasize their voice by supporting it and being like, yeah, Jenna, that was a great thing to say. Absolutely. You're totally right. And like Gordon talked about earlier, bringing his wife's voice into those meetings. Hey, this is what my wife was sharing, and she's right. We should listen to her. Like those are really great ways that we can support that and bring their role into our community and strengthen our community by doing that. And the other thing that I was thinking is just by getting out of the way sometimes. I've had the opportunity to co-lead Bible talks in the past with Mariah Mendez, who is recently, relatively recently moved out of country. But if anybody knows Mariah, like she's got an incredible brain and an incredible voice for God and heart and spirit. And so, I mean, a lot of the time, it was just me getting out of the way of letting her speak, and I love that. It was really incredible. And I think it was to the benefit of our group so often to just get out of the way. So those are the two things that I really feel like I just wanted to share was to be better men. I think in our communities, we can get out of the way of people who, don't always have the same kind of voice, and we can help amplify their voice. Thank you guys.
Well, we are out of time. Hi, everybody. It's good to be able to have been here. Thank you, Juliana, again for being here, and congratulations. And everybody stay safe. But Juliana, please, we're praying for you. Stay safe. Tyler, of course, thanks. And thanks for the thoughts that you shared. Jenna, thanks for all the stuff you've been doing for us, for producing tonight. We appreciate that. And your comments were really great. Gordon, thank you. And to everybody else, there's a longer conversation between Gordon and me. And hang on just a second, Carl. Hey, Carl, wait just a second. That was perfect. That's the way I want to do it. But the last time we did it, am I louder than Carl?
Yes, you're fine.
I want to be sure you hear. Okay,
yeah,
keep on.
You're spotlighted. You're fine.
we got to get this right. Go ahead. Back to it, Carl. Do that. Let me feel in the room. There's a longer conversation between Gordon and me that's going to be available immediately or as soon as it will upload or download or buffer or whatever that they do, Anison. It's going to be on our website, and I think it's also going to be posted live here. Tomorrow night, come back. We've got Michael Patterson. Wednesday night, we've got Michael Burns. Thursday night, Kit Cummings. And Friday night, the most awesome Mike Tolliver will be here with us. As always, wash your hands, don't touch your face, wear a mask, stay in, stay safe, and please, everybody, keep yourselves in the love of the Lord.
Amen.